the easy one, if you work at a company and that has a sales department or a marketing department, is just spending more time with them, right? And really ask questions, make the, become best friends with them and be, hey, like, what are you hearing the sales calls? Like, what are, like, when you talk about this feature, like, what gets people excited, what doesn't, and what objections do you get? And who do you, based on the calls you have, like, who do you think would benefit from this? And I think just using them as like a proxy to understand like how people make decisions, and how to decide to buy a product or not, I think it can really accelerate your path. Same thing with marketing, right?
Hi, everyone. I am thrilled to be here today with Marc Baselga, the founder of Supra, where we're going to be talking about what it takes to land a product leadership role right now and how to negotiate your next product leadership role. I'm Irene Yu. I am the CEO and founder of Skiplevel, where I help product managers level up their technical skills, communicate better with engineers, and ace your next technical interview. If you want to read the full interview with Marc, head over to my newsletter at newsletter.skiplevel.co. Okay, let's do it. Marc, I am so excited to have you here today to share your personal journey as a product leader with us. So I thought that maybe to start us off, could you kind of introduce yourself and your journey from being a product manager to a product leader and then to founding Supra?
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, super quick. I grew up in Spain, in Barcelona, and then basically my family decided to move to the United States when I was 17. So I finished high school in Boston. Then I went to university in the States, in Cornell, upstate New York. And yeah, and I was super lucky that I convinced Asana, the work management tool, to hire me as their first PM new grad when the company was still pretty small. They had just raised a Series C. And yeah, it was really an amazing kind of first role out of college, because I was, by far the most junior person in the product team. I had all these really experienced product leaders and founders to learn from. And the company was also still pretty small, right? It was like under 200 people. But over the 5 years that I was there, we experienced really a lot of fast growth. We went from under 200 to over 2,000. We raised a Series D and E. We went public. And yeah, that had really allowed me to touch a lot of different parts of the product, and continue to learn from a really talented team, both on the product and engineering side. And then, yeah, after Asana went public, it was, definitely a very different company than the one I joined. And I was craving really to go back to a smaller company that moved a little bit faster. And I also had curiosity to see, hey, I've seen what it takes to take a company from a Series C to an IPO. I really want to see like kind of what it takes to go from 0 to 1 at a company. So I was recruited into a Series A startup in the clinical trial space, where I was brought in to lead the product team. And yeah, the company had just raised a 30 million round from 8VC and Optum. So they were very well funded. And yeah, it was an interesting transition in many ways. First time doing that early stage, also first time doing health tech. And yeah, I think the role it was really interesting and challenging in a way, because I was directly reporting into the founder CEO. He was a solo founder, part of the exec team. And I think for the first time in my career, I felt like, hey, I'm the kind of the most senior product person in the company, and I felt pretty isolated. So one of the most useful things that I started doing at that time is I started to meet with other heads of product at Series A companies, and either people in my network or people who are like, hey, this person seems to have a relevant background. I want to reach out to them and see if they're down to talk. And yeah, we started to meet recurrently once a month, and we'd really use that time to share our challenges and also help each other problem solve, right? Like, be like, hey, here's how I tackled this problem before. Here's what worked well for me. Also, share how we're organizing our time. How are we managing our time? What's high leverage? What's not? And repeatedly, this meeting that we had once a month ended up being, one of the highest leverage things that I did on a monthly basis. So that took me down this rabbit hole of really exploring, okay, there's something here, right? When you bring, a cohesive group of people that have something in common, where there's trust, there's intentionality. So I started to put together more groups. I had friends who recently had transitioned from, ICs to managers, and they were experiencing similar challenges, and the feedback continued to be really positive, and then one thing led to another, and that way Supra was born. And then now, fast forward 2.5 years, we have a thriving community of product leaders. We have over 300 members now, and yeah, I feel super lucky to be able to do this as my full-time thing. I've gotten to meet some really amazing people, not just members of our community, but also like speakers or even just guests that we have in our podcast, including yourself. So yeah, that's kind of how I got here and what I'm doing now. And guys, I'll pause there.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. There are so many parts of your journey that I want to ask, questions about. But the thing that stuck out to me was how you kind of went through a big transition of like understanding leadership, right? And being in a leadership role. And then very organically, all of the problems that came from that, you then found this like solution for, or a community that really speaks to that experience, and you can kind of help each other. And that's how you started Supra. And that kind of reminds me of how I started Skiplevel as well, like kind of identifying a problem, and then seeing, something that could really help that. I'm curious because you also mentioned learning from leaders at Asana during their growth from Series C, and then growing to a much larger company. Were there any specific leadership lessons from that experience that have proven really valuable in your own product leadership roles and now in Supra?
Yeah, there's a couple. I think the first one, I make the joke that I peaked early. What I mean by that is like the team that we had at Asana was probably one of the highest density teams in terms of talent that I've ever been a part of. Like super smart people, both in engineering and in design, product, and yeah, maybe for people that don't know. So the funny story about Asana is that Asana was co-founded by the co-founder of Facebook, who was Mark Zuckerberg's roommate, Dustin Moskovitz. And actually, Asana was actually started inside of Facebook. So one of the reasons why Facebook was able to scale so quickly was because they built this internal tool where people could track, tasks and things like that. And that eventually, the founder that was kind of working on the weekends was Dustin, and he was like, "Hey, there's something really special here." He was also working with their first kind of PM that they hired, who was the other co-founder of Asana, Justin Rosenstein. And eventually they're like, "Hey, this tool has been so powerful for our, scaling Meta and Facebook. So now we actually want to take it and allow other teams to benefit from this." And basically they asked Mark, "Hey, can we start these on our own?" And of course, Mark was like, "Go for it." But yeah, and I think both Dustin and Justin realized that the importance of building a really, smart team would allow people to move quickly and really build a really strong foundation that then will allow the company to scale and really continue to grow at a very natural pace. I think that's one, like just hire really smart people. The other thing that Asana did that was really interesting is they were power users of their own tool. And I think that really helped, like no matter what role you were in Asana, you basically had to use Asana for everything. And I think that really allowed everyone to build a really strong empathy for what works, what doesn't, and really always have almost, no matter what your function was, to like have ownership or be like, "Hey, here's what we could do to make it better." So I think like having the entire company feeling very passionate about improving the tool was I think a good thing. The other thing that was interesting about Asana is, a lot of tech companies, when you look at people, they change jobs like maybe every 3 years, 4 years, but it was pretty common to see people at Asana that had been at the company for 8 years or 10 years. And I think the reason why they were able to do that is because they built a really strong culture. And while I think culture is often like this nebulous term that people are like, is this worth it? Like, does it really make a difference? Like, I really saw it firsthand that it makes a huge difference, not only for attracting people, but also for retaining people, right? And I think when you're trying to build a team and growing a team, retaining people as you grow, I think really makes the entire scaling a lot easier. So those are some big ones that come to mind. I also learned things that I think didn't work well for Asana, right? Which I think they're equally important. I think given that one of the cultural elements was that I think we respected everyone's opinions and we wanted to be very thoughtful about everything we did. And I think a lot of times what ended up happening is we did overthink a lot of decisions, or we tried to get all the data before we made a decision. And I think that allowed us to move a little bit slower. And similar too, like given that everyone was so smart, there was like a really like high quality bar for what we shipped, or when something was ready to, or when a presentation was ready to make a decision. And again, I think that slowed us down. So I think um, while I did appreciate the value of having really high standards or being very thoughtful, I think there's definitely a balance of between like perfection and speed and flexibility. And I think it was really healthy for me to then go back, to go to a Series A company where you had to move a lot faster. Done was better than perfect. So I think I was lucky to have those experiences go one after the other, because it really kind of shaped how I think about like culture and speed of execution and things like that.
Yeah, that's the what comes to mind when I hear your answer, that I try to remind myself all the time, is that there is no such thing as perfection, and that imperfection should really be the standard, that we're like, that's the norm. Things aren't
Yeah.
perfect, that's the norm. But it sounds like, that experience was um was really eye-opening for you, in seeing what worked and what didn't. And so I kind of wanted to touch on, you mentioned in your interview that understanding go to market was a really crucial skill. Could you kind of elaborate on how product leaders should approach building this competency, especially if they come from a more technical background where sales and marketing might not be their forte, having now, built at a company that went from 10 to 100 or from 0 to 1?
Yeah. I mean, to give a context, like if you asked me maybe like 4 years ago, I'm not sure if I would have given that answer of like go to market as being something that I wish I learned sooner. But I think there's like a set of events that happened maybe in the last 2 or 3 years that I think really have put me down that path and almost like push for this agenda almost. The first one was like kind of after the zero interest rate era was over, the famous ZERP. I think a lot of companies start to think, hey, like product teams should not only be responsible for building great products that customers love. That's obviously table stakes, but also you should be responsible for moving the needle for the company in terms of business outcomes, right? But I think a lot of product leaders and PMs didn't really know how to do that, because they never really were forced to think about go to market and think about, hey, how does my product actually move those metrics? I think that's one that I was like, I think really was a wake up call for the product community around, hey, like we really need to think more about this. Then the other one that's kind of that makes this point probably even more important is like the new AI revolution, if you will, right? Where AI is really reducing the cost of building. Like you can get to, from idea to prototype to maybe working up in what before may have taken a year, now maybe you can take like 2 or 3 months, right? So now that building is almost commoditized, right? Like the people or the companies that are really going to have an advantage are the ones that are really good, that have a really good intuition of what it takes to actually reach customers, and what it takes to actually to not only just reach customers, but also convince those customers to buy your product. So anyways, all that to say that I think go-to-market has become more and more important over the last 3 years. And I think given that your role as a PM is, making sure that people are using your product, I think having a good intuition for how to do that is really important. So how can product leaders get better at go-to-market? So to be honest, I'm still figuring that out part myself, but I think there's a few things that you can do. The easy one, if you work at a company that has a sales department or a marketing department, is just spending more time with them, right? And really ask questions, make the, become best friends with them and be, hey, like what are you hearing the sales calls? Like what are, like, when you talk about this feature, like what gets people excited, what doesn't, and what objections do you get? who do you, based on the calls you have, like who do you think would benefit from this? And I think just using them as like a proxy to understand like how people make decisions, and how to decide to buy a product or not, I think it can really accelerate your path. Same thing with marketing, right? Same thing with like understanding like what are the different channels that we use to reach users, and kind of like once someone converts, like where do they go? Just start to build an intuition of like, what are the different acquisition channels for users, and kind of like what different questions customers have in different parts of the journey. And then the other one that I think it's also really helpful is that, it's a little bit easier when you work at a company that already has, let's say, a user base and a channel built from scratch. So it's almost like you're cheating a little bit. But if you really want to get the experience yourself, build a side hustle and try to make some money with it, right? And try to market it, try to sell it. And I think that you'd also get a good intuition for it as well.
Yeah, I love that answer. As someone who is a software engineer and I focus so much on, building a product, right? Just strictly building a product. Sales and marketing is a whole different beast, and an extremely important skill. Especially if you do a side project, but also if you work at a company where, you could build a product, but if no one's going to use it, then there wasn't really a point in actually building that product. And I think the thing that sales and marketing and building actually shares, and product management shares, is that if you do enough sales and marketing, it's both about actually understanding the customer and understanding what is the pain point that they're looking to solve and how to actually solve it. So that's really interesting. I really appreciate you sharing your experience.
Yeah, something that I learned from this Series A startup, and then the founder that I was there, and he was like a third or fourth time founder, was something that it blew my mind when I first saw it, is that he would go into sales calls with just Figma mocks, right? And he would sell people on Figma mocks. And I was like, at Asana, we never did that. I was like, that's crazy. Like, you're just selling us something that we don't even know, like, how long is it going to take to build, or if it's doable. And he told me, like, listen, like, it's much better for us to figure out if we can sell this. And then it's a much better problem to have to then figure out how to build it than the other way around, that we spend 6 months building something and then we cannot sell it. So if you're going from 0 to 1, he was like, you always need to first sell, because user research is not that useful, right? People will tell you, yeah, of course, I would use this. But the real truth is, like, are people paying you money? Are they signing the contract? And until they don't sign the contract, you never know what's going to happen, basically.
I completely agree with that. That's also in line with my own experience. And whenever new founders come to me, and ask me for advice, and they say, yeah, my friends all love it. I'm like, of course your friends would say that, right? But are they willing to pay for it? Are people willing to pay for it? And until that money is in your hand, you don't really know if you have a product or what you're building is actually like really worth the time. So I definitely agree with that. I think some of our listeners are product managers, and they are really interested into moving into product leadership roles. And some of them might actually be interviewing for them. So I was curious if you had any sort of tips for how they might move from an IC, a product management role, into product leadership roles. Should they be looking outside of the companies, within the companies, or are there any other tips that you could offer?
That's a great question. So yeah, so basically, if someone is in a senior IC role and they want to make it into a people management role, and they're trying to figure out what is the best path to get there, what I usually found is that the easiest way is to do it while you're in a company, like an internal transfer, rather than getting hired by an external company. And the reason being is, if you've never been a manager, right, it's a really risky bet to hire someone who's never been a manager, right? In that case, the company who's hiring for a position, they would just find someone who's been a manager, because it really just de-risks the hiring. And I think that's actually kind of the name of the game in the product leadership hiring market. Recruiters and hiring managers are really optimizing to make sure, how do we find someone that we know they're going to work from the get-go, and that we're kind of reducing entropy, right? So they're trying to find people that maybe if you're a Series A company that's trying to scale to Series B and Series C, like you're going to find someone who's done that kind of evolution, right? So they've seen the problem before, and maybe they've seen the next two phases. Or if you're in the insurance tech space, maybe finding someone that has experience in the insurance tech space. And people management is the same thing, right? You want to find someone who has done that before. So now maybe the most helpful thing to do would be to talk, how can you actually make that transfer happen internally? And from what I've seen from a lot of Supra members that have successfully navigated that is, one, I think even though you don't get maybe the job right away, is to find opportunities to like exercise that muscle, right, of being a product leader, right? And one of them is maybe kind of mentoring and coaching like younger PMs. So maybe taking someone who's early in their career and really helping them kind of up level their craft and get better and really like be these agents of change in their career and really helping them get better and make it very clear what is the since you started working with them, what is the impact that this, how has the person's impact improved over time. That's one. The other day too, like when you're product leaders, they're almost like resource allocators, right? Like they're really good, like they have 4 or 5 teams, and they have to be really good to know, hey, here are the bets that we're investing in, here's what we're investing in. You're kind of managing a portfolio. So finding opportunities where you can very clearly show, hey, like here's how I've done that successfully within my program, and these are the bets that I've done, and and now I'm ready to do that at a higher scale. Like if you can demonstrate that, that's another great way to do it. And then the other big thing is a lot of these promotions happened in kind of like calibration committees, right? So I think you need to be really good at getting best visibility, right? And that means that your skip level needs to know about your work, your skip level peers need to know about your work too. So I think finding opportunities to present in high stake meetings or kind of network internally, and really when you have the opportunity to engage with those stakeholders, cause a really strong impression, because I think those are going to be the ones that are going to decide, hey, I want Irene to actually get promoted because I've been really impressed with all the interactions that I had with her, right? Those are the ones that you really have to convince. So those are a few things that come to mind.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So what I hear you saying is typically it's better for you to try to do an internal role into product leadership instead of trying to find a separate role outside of the company. And the second thing is, in order to get that promotion, you always want to advocate for yourself as loudly as possible, which I know for some people who might not be used to that sort of advocacy for themselves might feel a little bit uncomfortable, but it is pretty important. So
yeah. And I think maybe, I don't think it's like, my point is not necessarily like, I think of course that has to happen, but I think it's like almost like you have to plant those seeds like way before that advocacy happens, right? Like you need to create those opportunities where you're engaging with those stakeholders, like maybe like a year before, right? And you demonstrate competency in front of them. So you really need to start kind of networking and managing up and kind of showing, hey, like I would be excited to interact more with this person because they're really good. And I believe that if we give them more responsibility and more resources, they're actually going to turn those resources into, higher ROI for our company, and it's going to lead to more revenue. So I think that just kind of basically like you need to start showing yourself and your worth to the people that are going to be making the decision, basically.
Yeah, and definitely building that relationship and having people trust you as a product leader.
Exactly.
For those who might already be product leaders or they're looking for a product leadership role outside of their current company, when it comes to negotiation, you emphasized in our interview that focusing on your unique value prop rather than market benchmarks. So I'm curious, what is your advice for product leaders who struggle to articulate the impact in concrete business terms?
Yeah. And the thing that I'll say here is that, benchmarks are really helpful to get a sense whether you're in the ballpark of actually like what you should be paying for your level. But at the end of the day, like it's almost like a losing game if you're trying to compare benchmarks, because like the company is likely going to say that they have more benchmarks or they have more resources or they're paying for different resources or different benchmarks that are more up to date. So like at that point, it's almost like if you're at the point, hey, like my benchmarks and your benchmarks are different, the company is always going to be like, okay, my benchmarks are more correct. So I think that's like kind of like a losing battle. So then then the key then, if you want to negotiate, is you want to have to kind of get away from those benchmarks, right? And really show, kind of vouch for your unique value proposition. And your unique value proposition is basically like, here's the unique thing that I can provide to the company that maybe no one else can provide or very few people can provide. And that actually becomes more and more true as you become more senior, right? Like if you are a CPO who specializes in Series B companies in the insurance tech space, maybe there's 25 people that can do that, right? So, and the key thing there is, when you're, one is, the thing that's really important is like, one, understanding kind of like, what are the challenges? Like when you're in the interview loop, really understanding what are the challenges and the goals that this company have, right? Like, are they trying to grow revenue? Do they have a problem where they ship very slowly, right? And they need someone who's going to really like pick up the velocity in how quickly they ship features, right? But anyway, a lot of times, like, it's basically like, it all boils down to like, how are you going to impact either the bottom line or the top line of the company, right? What you want to share is like, what is the impact that you've had in your previous role in terms of like business metrics, right? Like, hey, like this initiative has actually helped my previous company, let's call it like Shopify, save $40 million for XYZ reasons. And I think based on what I'm hearing in the interview loop, I think I could do something similar for this company, and here's how long it would take, right? And if I'm getting these outcomes, right, like the equity and the salary that I'm asking seems pretty reasonable, right? Or I think if we launch this initiative and we get this team off the ground, I think we can actually sell this as an add-on, and it could unlock, an additional maybe like $100 million for the ARR of the company in the next 2 years, right? And then at that point, be like, hey, if that's something that you want, I think here's kind of what I think would be a fair thing for me to get. So I think just making it less about like, hey, like here's what the benchmark is saying, more of like, here's what I can do for you. If I do this for you and I can deliver on that, like what is that worth to you? And kind of trying to find an alignment there.
Yeah, I really love that. I think sometimes when we do interviews, we go into it thinking, these are my skills, but really tying it back to the business outcomes of the business, that really is very high impact. So that's really great advice, Marc. Thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me today and doing this interview. I certainly learned a lot. So my last question for you is, where can our readers find you?
Yeah. So first of all, thank you so much for having me. I hope the audience finds it helpful. I'm very active on LinkedIn. I try to post every day, so you can find my name and last name there. Feel free to send me a message if I can be helpful. Then if you're a product leader who's looking for jobs, I also have a newsletter that's called Supra Insights, where we post interesting job openings every 2 weeks. That you might find that helpful if you're in that demographic. And also we have a podcast called Supra Insider. It's also in Substack. We can probably also add the links to the newsletter as well. We have fun conversations with interesting people. We actually had Irene in the podcast a couple of weeks ago. So if you haven't listened to that episode, we highly recommend you check it out. But thank you so much. This is really fun.
This was awesome. Thank you so much, Marc.
Amazing. Thank you so much.